Well, good morning. My name is David Biet. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program on Step Lightly, China's Ecological Footprint Overseas. Now, why the Canada Institute, you say? Well, we like seas, and Jennifer will talk about that. But we also have, as a public policy scholar this fall, Wenran Jiang from University of Alberta, who's been shared by Jennifer's program and my program, the Canada Institute and the China Environment Forum. And we thought we would do something connecting China and Canada. And Jennifer and I have worked together before, and we've always come up with really interesting programs. So I think this is going to be an interesting program, too. Just briefly, the Canada Institute was founded in 2001 to look at the United States' largest trading partner, Canada. And what we do is try to look at the relations between Canada and the United States in essentially three areas: trade, border security, and in this case, energy and environment. I think today's an apt day to be working with the China Environment Program because Prime Minister Stephen Harper is in Beijing meeting with Chinese leaders. And the big news this morning is that Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, is that the Globe Mail reports, publicly upbraided Prime Minister Stephen Harper for failing to visit China sooner. This is your first visit to China, and this is the first meeting between the Chinese Premier and a Canadian Prime Minister in almost 5 years, he said. So, our speakers this morning have been busy in the hall before the program speaking with the Canadian media, but we'll turn our attention...
told them they can't leave in the middle of the presentation.
No, and we'll turn our attention away from whether Stephen Harper should have visited earlier to the program on extractive industries. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and she'll do the rest.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we've made the joke for the last 4 or 5 years that why we work together is that both of our projects have countries that start with a C and end in an A. Right, China and Canada. I direct the China Environment Forum. I've been here for 10 years. Go team, go. I still am looking for a party. I have to come up with a party idea. And next year's even better because next year's going to be the Year of the Tiger, which is my year. So year 11 will rock. Yeah, and so like all projects here, we bring together government, NGO, business, and researchers to talk about my project, talk about all things China, energy, and environment. And as you see the three speakers here, we've got 3 different sectors of speakers. All of them, there is a link to China, obviously, since the meeting title has China in it. We were good enough to do that. And the 3 Cs, of course, the ironic, what we're looking at China's resource extraction overseas, and not as a slamming China, but trying to get to some of the subtleties. It's a very complex issue, and I actually learned a lot about the complexities of it in my involvement for a year in a USAID-supported project called Asia's Future, where my team and the Environmental Change and Security Program here, we looked at global trends impacting the environment in Southeast Asia. And, it's rather embarrassing. I do China, so for many years, I just did China. And now with the Asia Futures Project, I started looking much more at Southeast Asia. And I was invited on because China is a big trend that is impacting Southeast Asia, not just resource extraction or animal trade issues, but also the investment in the region. And politically, there's a lot going on that it's not all negative, right, and its impact on Southeast Asia. And that led me to kind of look at questions, China's broader influence overseas, and then, as in China, for the Chinese people in the room, Yuan, fun, fate and destiny. Wenran Jiang shows up here to be our fellow. We invited him because we dig him. He's spoken for us before. He was at our first Canada-China meeting, I think. Yeah. He's a lot of history with us. And he actually, and he'll tell you some, I've given him permission to do some rampant anecdotalism this morning, okay? Is that okay? Because DC's full of boring meetings. We want some stories about how this man who's doing energy stuff between Canada and China, and then he kind of goes wandering off to the Congo with, I think, maybe one introduction, and then he emails me on his second visit say, I just had lunch with some Chinese miners. I'm like, are you okay, Wenran? And so, but it ends up that this has become one of his new research areas. And so that kind of gave us the idea that with my work on Asia Futures, looking at Southeast Asia, Wenran in Africa, and I want to hang out with Dave and the Canada Institute, that all these forces came together. That's why we're here today, and that you happily came to listen. So the 3 speakers, we're going to start off with Wenran. You have his bio. Renaissance man, has done everything. But one of his most recent publication is called, aptly enough, Chinese Companies in the Extractive Industries of Gabon and the DRC, Perceptions of Transparency. He's going to write a similar piece for me, just putting public pressure on you, Wenran, because it's due. And And so he's going to start off talking again about focusing on the copper industry in Congo and the involvement of Chinese companies. And then we're going to move on to Terry Parnell. And she works at the East-West Management Institute Biodiversity and Grassroots organization. She's an advocacy advisor in Cambodia. But today, I mean, she has got 15 years experience doing on-the-ground development work, as building and assisting networks of farmers, fishers, indigenous communities around all kinds of natural resource rights issues. So today she's speaking as Terry. Mm-hmm. You know, we gave her a chance to kind of take off her hat and just really talk about reflecting on some of her own insights and China, and I'm sure over the 15 years that Terry, you've seen a big change in not just China's involvement, but globally. Countries all around the world are going to Southeast Asia and extracting resources. And so want to get behind some of the subtleties of the trends there. So she'll be looking at mainly focusing on Cambodia, but probably talking a little more broadly as well. And then we have Victor Jirkai Gao, who's a buddy of Wenran's. So we were able, that's how we happily found him. He's currently a director of China National Association of International Studies and an international counselor of Asia Society. And he has an extensive working experience in investment banking and corporate management, working with Morgan Stanley and its joint venture China International Capital Corporation. And of relevance for today's meeting, that where he got a lot of your insights, was serving in a variety of senior management positions with the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation. And the other thing about that has nothing to do with today's talk, though, is that he also, in the Chinese Foreign Service, also was interpreter for the late Deng Xiaoping early on, which tells you that also his English is amazing, better than mine. And he's going to talk about China's growing investment in petroleum extraction in Canada, and I fancy can probably talk about it in other regions of the world as well, correct? Did I just put you on the spot there, Victor? Okay, so this is the order. Wenran, Terry, and Victor. Your job as audience members is to sit obediently, think of difficult questions for at the end, and we're going to move forward. Are we ready? All right. And everyone's like, tell this woman to stop talking. Wenran, it's you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Maybe I will grab that laptop over here.
Are you going to grab the...
Yeah. Is that okay? Would that be okay?
No. Do the wires reach?
I think Peter told me.
He told you. Okay,
it is okay. I don't know how long.
Why don't you just switch with Terry? Change places with Terry.
Okay. Sounds good.
I'm not all about changing computers.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah.
And then also, because he said he's got lots of slides, and this way I can kind of rein him in.
That's right. So, okay, now. See.
Oh, slideshow. Yes, slideshow.
Yeah. Here we go.
So the thing is, the problem is when they change the Word versions, then those of us who are stuck in the ancient times of Word.
I use a Mac, but that's good.
I do
now.
too. So.
That's good. Well, thanks, Jennifer and David. I'm grateful for the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me as a public policy scholar, providing funding to do this research. As Jennifer said, I owe her a major piece of research paper
on
my case studies in Africa. I will try to finish off as soon as possible for the review. But today, what I'm going to do is to probably kick off to start with China's extractive industries, energy, ecological footprints in Africa, and particularly some of the little stories of my field research in southern part of Democratic Republic of Congo, called Lubumbashi, which is the bordering Zambia. It's a little copper town in the Katanga province, southern part of Congo. I found it very interesting. I'm trained as a China East Asia specialist. I know I will never become an African expert, and so I can't travel to all African countries. So I have decided I will just go back to the case in one spot that on a sectoral basis. So in this case is mining. It's specifically about copper and cobalt extraction of Chinese enterprises, copper smelters. I've been there twice, extensively, each about a week. And first time, a lot of interviews. Second time, basically, I just went into the field with them to eat together, to work with them a little bit, and to travel to the mines. But let me start with a broader context, and then move to, again, China and DRC relations, and probably I should put my focus on the third element, which is some of the walkthrough with some of the photos I took in the field. This was last year in September, and this year in June and July. I traveled to South Africa, Zambia, Gabon, and particularly Lubumbashi, DRC, which I've been there twice. For those who are not familiar with the broader context of China's overseas overall expansion in terms of energy and resource extraction, you need to probably think of, I'm not going to go into details, but that's something you can look at every graph on every category. China is going way up and fast. And in terms of numbers, China going on, I have revised this chart only to change from 3 to 2, from 2 to 1 over the past few years. This is quite amazing on how the Chinese are moving. So a lot of people talking about what is the bigger picture, the trajectories of the future. Is this a one-off, China of the Soviet Union in the 1970s, China of Japan in the 1980s, or this is something of a China in the early 20th century, like the United States vis-a-vis the Great Britain? And I happen to think it is the beginning of the end of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. hegemony, and we're into a period of uncertainty and the systemic disequilibrium, and we need to manage that, manage China's rise in a very important way. And the Chinese traditional development model here is really the driver of why China is doing all these things abroad, as we're going to move forward in terms of needing resources for feeding its domestic development. And in many ways, remember, the foreign multinational corporations, through diversification, redivision of global output, has moved many of the polluting and heavy energy use industries to China. Mm-hmm. And we produce them in China now and export them back home. And then we turn around saying China is hungry for energy and resources. That's in part feeding us, by the way. And there's clear correlation between China's export-oriented economy and energy consumption and resource consumption. Remember, more than 60% of China's exports are procured, managed, and produced by foreign multinationals, mainly Americans, in China now. So this kind of feeding frenzy of resources are making China very heavy industry-oriented in terms of material demands, in terms of share of production. These are numbers probably you already know. And in recent months, people talk about, metal, copper price. You can see in the recovery process, China's stimulus package in the past year has been really working. So therefore, iron, copper, many sectors are picking up speed very quickly. But back to the ecological footprint issue, China remains to be heavily dependent on fossil fuels, especially coal. This is the percentage of China's very screwed up energy structure, which is nearly 70% using coal. That is not going to change much by the year 2030 and more. So therefore, China is emitting a lot more of carbon dioxide, and mostly due to the coal use. And this is not going to change much if you can see the future directions. So now, with all the economic downturns, China is doing more stimulus and more spending. And you can see from these numbers, you can come back. I don't want to spend more time on this, but it's just massive amount of spending, because China is moving another 350 million people to the cities in the next 10 to 15 years, as they have done in the past 10 to 20 years. And that's just the basic fact. I mean, China, except the external demand dimension, internally, they will do all this list of the things, and they're going to rank all the way to the rest of the world to overtake Japan next year or this year, and overtake the United States very soon in terms of overall economic capacity. And foreign investment began to pick up, big speed, especially in the energy and resource sectors. And China, with 2.2 trillion plus foreign reserves, most of them in the dollar assets, they feel very vulnerable. Therefore, the latest strategy is to diversify them away from treasury bonds and into more and more real assets, as many Chinese call it, tangible overseas assets in energy and resources. And that is the bigger picture. So then the question is, are Chinese taking, up Africa in terms of new frontier, just basically to swallow it? I picked this up from the internet. I mean, this looks pretty neat. In a sense, yes and no. China now overtakes the United States as the largest trading partner to Africa. Not a huge volume, considering the whole continent, but U.S. only managed to $104 billion last year. And this year, for the first 6 months, I just looking at the latest data, it dropped to something like $60 billion up to September. So I added another third in that trajectory. To the end of the year, the U.S. may actually do trade just about 80 million. This is a sharp drop. If China just managed to keep not dropping so much, it will again consolidate its position as the largest trading partner. So in that sense, China is moving very fast in many of these areas. Some of these countries are heavily dependent on resource export to China. Period. Angola, Congo, and other countries. On the import part from China is heavily commodities in terms of energy and minerals. That's well over 80%. In terms of Chinese exports to Africa, it's very diversified: machinery, manufacturing goods, down to cheap plastics. You name it. So it's not really balanced in terms of a relationship that is extractive in nature. China getting all these minerals from Africa and going back selling products. So some people may easily conclude that China is taking up Africa for lunch. In some ways, Nigeria, if you look at on this column, many of these countries do have heavy oil exports to China in terms of trading. But do not be misled by some of the figures. The Chinese, even as what they do, picking up speed, is still quite small in terms of share of buying African oil, globally. Okay, it is the speed and rhythm that is pretty striking. It is not the total volume yet, although the total volume of trade is indeed in there. In terms of big players in the oil energy companies in Africa, you can see where Sinopec and CNPC, these big guys, it's all ranking in the bottom in the global big majors. In terms of commercial values, we know China is not quite there yet, but you do see major African mineral exports to China. I was giving 3 days workshop with British diplomats in Johannesburg not long ago. None of them actually know these numbers. I asked them. So I said, just remember 70% of cobalt of Africa go to China, 60% of manganese of Africa go to China, 40% of copper go to China, and 50% of iron. So these are the, I think, easier to remember numbers at the bigger picture. So what about DRC, China, and Congo? This is the third largest country, one of the poorest, ranking dead last top, maybe number three from the bottom in terms of UN Human Development Index. And but the Chinese like to call the country a last virgin land of resources. So that's why this is where they would like to see and they were to go. And it's not a good place to do business either. It's ranking by Transparency International's index, ranking, I think, 177 out of 179 in the countries to do business with. So some of the charts I have, is Jennifer mentioned, is from this report that I've done together with Stellenbosch University researchers for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, partly also funded by Revenue Watch Institute in New York. You can see that in 2007, China is not quite there in terms of trade with DRC. And this is the latest number in 2008. So this is the microscopic reflection of China's surge in terms of trade volume just about with everybody. And I was just writing a piece yesterday about Canadian Prime Minister Harper's visit to China. We talk all about the bilateral relations and importance. I said the most important thing is that China is on its way to overtake Canada as the largest trading partner of the United States in a matter of a few years. Canada is doing with the U.S. We always say every day $2 billion of bilateral border trade. Soon it's going to be China and the United States will be the story. And the challenge is right at, south of the border. In many of these takeovers, China overtaken Mexico and Japan already as the largest trading partner with the United States, with everybody else as well at the same time. And so these are the numbers. If you look at the DRC exports to China, it's heavily about minerals and resources. And if you look at the imports, then it's more comprehensive from China. So you do have this imbalanced kind of structure, exports, imports. So the big story, of course, Congo, everybody is talking about, is this big deal of $8.5 to $9 billion signed, finalized last year. But this is just among many of the other big energy and resource deals that China has been doing around the world. And so there's a clear correlation between the Chinese industrial output and the copper demand. And the copper demand is going up. And Congo happens to have not only diamond, iron ore, and many others, but 10% of global reserve for copper. And that is the kind of the story I want to talk about, because we can talk about the $9 billion deal later in the Q&A period, but that has been only at the initial stage. We can say the Chinese are doing a job that will transform this country, because the country's budget is only about $1 billion a year, and China is putting in about $9 billion, and put about 15 to 20% of that will be directly contracted to local workers, providing infrastructure, building hundreds of hospitals, building universities, building roads, railways. Many of these have nothing to do with the direct extraction of resources. They're basically, if you look at the items that are on that $9 billion deal, and if they can do it, the country will be totally transformed. So the question now is, what is the consequences, and what would be the cost, and what would be the impact on environment? And that is yet to be studied on that massive scale. And of course on labor, on migration, the Chinese are going to, in those agreements, China would own about close to 70% of the total operation, but China is going to only use 1 in 5 laborers only out of China has to be 80% local laborers. So there are a lot of good things, good codes written in there. We just don't know about the implementation. But I want to kind of move away a little bit from this bigger picture. Everybody is trying to comprehend the Chinese government engagement. I went to Lubumbashi in the fall of last year. I was totally surprised. I interviewed many copper smelters around Lubumbashi. This is the area that has copper. And by the way, with some less than 70 million people, about 20 million people in Congo depended one way or the other on this kind of what they call the artisanal extraction. The individual miners going into the mines to dig up individually.
Someone's cell phone?
Yeah, somebody's cell phone. So You have 2 or 3 million small miners working, collect mines, and then hand over them to the Chinese and to other mining smelters. And if we calculated average 5 dependents per miner, you're talking about 20-some million people. And many of these people have lost their jobs, maybe up to 300,000 or more, just in the economic downturn alone. These are kind of interesting stories. I can go through some of these and then give you some observations. The players in China, we know the state enterprise we talked about, and then there are large companies, medium-time and small-size enterprises. What interested me the most is to talk to these companies like this who will go there, buy several acres of land outside in a suburb of Lumumbashi, and then put in a few furnaces, and they're in business. About now, my statistics, fairly accurate, about 55 Chinese copper smelters alone around Lumumbashi. They all look like this, with a wall-up situation and with a gate with a name on it, and then you see that has to be protected in many ways. I will show you, if not protected, what it looks like, in the future. So you go in there with your car and you communicate through cell phone. Inside, the local guards will open the gate for you to go inside. And that's the kind of situation. You can see some of the facilities only partially used. Most of the places are not really utilized, but they just rounded up. These are infrastructural investments, and Indians were there as well, the others. But you can see this is a fairly large-scale operation. In this particular plant, you have on the right side all those minerals collected, concentrates, and then you have the lift and then go to the smelters. These are the kind of operation. One of the factories last year that was open, collecting and then smelting copper that is going to be sold on the, directly according to the London Commodity Exchange, prices. These are local workers, and these are the 1 ton copper that cost $9,000 per ton at the peak several years ago. That's when most of these Chinese medium small mine smelters gone to Congo for good buck. Most of these 50-plus smelter operators have no mining backgrounds nor expertise. Many of them just made money in China, in clothing industry, in East Coast, in Zhejiang, and then they heard copper price is high, and there's opening up in Congo. So let's go. Let's go there, buy a piece of land, move our furnaces over, and then can't go wrong kind of situation. So they were all, this is blindness, totally blind. And none of these people, 99%, I interviewed something up to about 30-some companies. Only one company said they were actually in touch. This is based in Hong Kong. They were in touch with the Chinese government's African Development Fund trying to get some government money. All these are medium, large, small. They've gone there all by themselves. So by the time I got there last fall, the copper was no longer 9,000 per ton. It was 6,000. We know later on it dropped to about 3,000 at the end of the year. Now it's recovering to about $6,000 range. Some of the begin, but at that time, at $6,000 per ton, they say the market is not good enough. We're not selling. These have good company, have good cash flows. They say we don't have to sell them. But then there's presidential guards not far away from many of these units because they got robbed on a regular basis. So I've been visiting, smelters in the trucks that has bullets holes in it. There are people who've been shot and then robbed. They don't use the banks. The banks are not dependable at all. So they all put in their cash in their safe, and then they will force you to open the safe. And some of the people say the presidential guards of the former president actually is in charge. And some of these, because of the downturn of the economic situation, they're not in operation anymore. By July this year, when I was there, out of 55 Chinese smelters, most of them are suspended
not in operation. Only 3 or 4 of them in operation. One of them defaulted on the salaries of local workers, which made the big news. And all of a sudden, European, North American newspapers are saying Chinese were the first to go to Africa, and then they were the first to run away, and they don't pay the wages at all. Out of 53, there was several of them gone bankrupt. Only one smaller company failed to pay wages, but that made it into the news. Most of them are saying we can't leave. We invested anywhere between $2-3 million up to $10 million for these kind of facilities. What do we do? This is a particular site that I visited, talked to the owners extensively. These are the people just got some money, several $1 million, and then come here, set up the furnace. Everything shipped from China through the containers. These are fire furnaces that is being banned in China because the Chinese copper mines have a much less concentrating copper, and this kind of smelting method will actually waste about 1% to 2% copper through the concentrate. So they say you can't do it anymore because you will have to, be more cautious in terms of extracting because the percentage is already very low in China. So here in Congo, I pick up a rock in the mine. It's like 35% copper. It's green. It's nice. And so they can afford, seem to be able to do this. On top of those 2 towers, there were supposed to be emission controls of smoke and dust and all that as a part. And I asked more than one smelters. Some of them do a good job, especially big ones. They want there to do the good thing, follow environmental regulations locally. Many of them don't care. They just put it up saying, well, it's not really working. And the local officials come, they say, it doesn't matter, it work or not. I just need this. And then they give you the papers. So in most cases, it was the local corrupt officials who would press the Chinese and turn a blind eye and just simply ask for a kickback. And of course, during my several visits, my accompanied person was on the cell phone saying there was one inspection from the official and saying the toilet is not clean enough. And the fine is $50,000. But after half an hour, the negotiation was already down to about 800. They say we continue to, negotiate. And then I went to washroom. That washroom looks very fine with me, It was outside washroom with a hole in the ground, and I don't know how it could be cleaner. But, they encountered, and then you could have fined up to 800,000, and you negotiate down to maybe 20,000. That's just the environment they operate in. And this thing has been not on the work, eventually abandoned. It's just not working anymore. They have no expertise, and the funding dry out from the domestic sources. The owner now every day in his dormitory playing chess, and his assistants basically saying, if we cannot do smelter business, I'll just do the trader business. So what happened is they have a few technicians who have equipment who can test the percentage of the copper concentrates, so they collect from locals. I was totally surprised. A little young girl out of China, not knowing the language, she became the middleman between the Congolese individual miners and the big company, big guys. How they could come here without the language, without anything, and doing all this and making the money. Well, they say the local people do not have the necessary skills just in testing the percentage. That's our advantage. They come here, we give them some money, we turn around, we sell to the bigger guys who smelt this. So that's the kind of situation. Others, I visited several who were trying to sell this to me. I'm from Canada. It's run down. This is not done by concrete, and locals and will come in. All the things that can be moved were already being looted at night. And others were, this is the well that was used to work. It's basically a completely, circled, self-contained system. You dig a well. It's not really in operation anymore. This is the abandoned one. You get water, and you get a diesel generator. So a typical plant would start generating electricity at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I actually help them to do this process. Fill in the gasoline, turn on the... they don't open the fridge during the days to save power. And then they will turn on the generator, and then the water will come. They will do the dinner. They will do the night, and then next day they will in the suspension mode. This is not they live in the conditions like this, all shipped from China through containers. Very quick setup. So how can you compete? The Western companies, they were holding the mining rights for, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years. And then when they decide to do feasibility studies, will do 2 or 3, 5 years. And then they build tennis court and the corporate quarters for their engineers to come. And then they began building. It's a long-term plan. They're doing it very well if they do it. The Chinese are saying, you got a deal? I got a deal. I'll come tomorrow. We set up this from China container. Everything's in operation. We do feasibility studies later. On this side, you have mining operation. On this side, you have mining operation. In the middle, it got to have copper. Why should I bother to do feasibility studies now? Just move in everything so we can live here. Locally grown vegetable within the yard, and washing facilities. These are just the very basics. And I was talking to this young lady who is a trader. And this is my friend who is accompanying me from the local. Interestingly, this is where we are. The story, I can go on with more, but the situation is this. Most of these individual copper smelters, some of them operating mines as well, they have no contact with the Chinese government whatsoever. Okay? We have situations that they were robbed, they were shot, and they were being held for ransom. And this friend of mine who is a French-speaking local interpreter who spent 4 or 5 years in France and come to join his brother's business, he said they called the Chinese embassy in Kinshasa. And many people are from southern part of China, Canton or some. They were in a panic situation. They were trying to get help, and the Chinese embassy was getting very impatient, saying, well, why don't you call back when you can speak better Mandarin? So they hung up on them. So you have situations like this. I brought this up to the ambassador, Chinese ambassador to Gabon, and she said such things actually happen because the Chinese are very, very behind in terms of registering local people. Gabon, a country with 1.5 million people, they have no idea how many Chinese street vendors and companies were actually operating in there, in that place. Can you believe in Congo and other places? So this guy, Li, as I call him, he put up his permanent resident status paper from France. And he told those people who held him, he said, look, if you hurt my friends from China, the French government will hold you responsible. And well, actually that worked. When he was telling me this story, he has tears in his eyes. He said, I feel so ashamed that the Chinese cannot protect me, the government. I have to pull out my French papers. So the myth that China is all over Africa with the government promoting Chinese business is just not quite there. It's a more complicated story. Chinese government does do a lot of business in Africa, but these people have no contact with the Chinese government at all, nor do they get help. I interviewed the Kantaga provincial minister of culture, and he said, what Chinese government? No Chinese government, no consulate. They have not visited us in any of the cultural sports activities at all. I don't know them. He pulled out his drawer and he took out a set of ping pong table. This was the only Chinese cultural thing I have, and it was donated by a local Chinese company who work here. So this idea of China using soft power of promoting its companies and get all its way and overriding everybody else, it's just very, very interestingly not present in this case study. And most of these people are saying they would love to have a better environmental regulation, better standards, transparency rules, but everybody else, French, Belgians, the Americans, they're all there. They're all playing the same game. The Chinese are latecomers. They may compensate what they lack, by doing something that's more explicit, But he said at the end of the day, everybody plays the same rules, pay the same bribes, operate in the same fashion. They were just, and they're complaining, the Western press just pick on China and the Chinese companies because they don't know the local rules as well. Some others are doing very well. They hire local medium management, French descent, Belgian descent. They own the company, medium management, all third generation, fourth generation French or Belgians who work with them seamlessly, working very well. In other cases, they don't even know what to do with the locals. They come, they knew. They have one story going back to China saying, when you come into the customs, everybody must pay, 5,000 francs. That's the rule. So the next thing you know, the Chinese delegation of 20 people coming in, everybody at the border, and then stuck in the passport is 5,000 francs. I mean, are you encouraging this by just, it's belonging to bordering ignorance in terms of stereotypes and how they know or do not know the local rules. Other people, Sinopec Gabon president, refused to pay any bribes. He said, I'm the company, I'm coming, they speak to me, I just tell them I don't speak the language, nor do I pay. They eventually still has to let him in. So you have all sort of modes of operations in there. And on the environmental front, the overwhelming story is that the local officials don't really care. So whatever Chinese do, it doesn't matter. So then the good ones, the good guys will do good job. And the bad guys will get away with paying bribes. They have to pay bribes anyway. That's what they say. So my question to them is, why bother? Why still have all these hardship, working, living in here? Well, at the end of this, still have money to make. In China, it's more competitive. The street vendor earns probably 1/3 than selling goods, say, in Libreville, Gabon, or in the downtown Lumumbashi. Chinese small vendors mixed with Congolese local people selling shoes to the ladies, women at the street corner. They come to do retail and then they sell there. So you have all sort of things going on. And I said, some of the questions says is really about the environmental thing. Many local people are basically saying, we have no food, we have no clean water, we have no road. What do you mean environment? We need all that. And we need jobs. Many of these companies now, Chinese companies, once they suspend, they range hiring from 30 to up to 200 people each smelter. When they are not in operation, people lose their jobs. People go into the street to riot. I've been in that situation, road blocked on our way to the mines, the police, the local army in camouflage, people are burning tires, dancing in the street. These young people are full of energy. And then I talked to the agriculture high officials, provincial government said any of these mining revenue has been transferred into agriculture at all, because I said I go to these mines along the way, I see line up children. They have nothing to eat. They have bearing. I said, what you need is agriculture. You know what they told me? They said, nothing in this province rich in mineral resources have been transferred into agriculture. Could you go back to Canada or China to give us some agriculture aid projects? That's what we need the most. Well, I just don't know where the story ends. So I was in Germany last November, and you have this young NGO, very enthusiastic person, stand up. He could be out of the Hugo Boss model setting with his clothing and everything, and saying, I really feel concerned that Chinese are going to cut down trees in Congo in order to do all these infrastructure projects. And I looked at him and I said, this is a no-brainer question. I said, are you telling me in this setting, in this postmodern structure building, with all what you enjoy, and you're telling the Congolese they shouldn't cut down the trees to build the road because they need to live a life. They have a life expectancy of 51 years old. What do you expect them to do? So we have many questions here that we need to ask. The Chinese side, really the market-driven, as I put here, the forces. In general, it is going to turn Africa into a resource base. But the Chinese also, the government especially, also want to do differently. want to aid Africa. That's why a lot of these packages are coming along. But at the same time, there are many layers of China operating in Africa, and in these stories, I just don't see the presence of the state. It's purely market-driven to the extent that these people were just operating on their own. And the Chinese government is being marginalized, even they wanted to do better. So I look at Hu Jintao when he went to Zambia to lecture the local people to do good. That is a very, very difficult task in comparison with the market forces, which is virtually ruthless in terms of profit making, in terms of competitiveness. And that's where we operate today. For China, at least, I think, in my observation in Africa, a lot of perception gaps, what people are thinking about China. China's stories in Africa is complex, and we have to study that in a complex manner, and we need to manage that in a complex manner. So I have had a piece, especially on domestic foreign policy connection of China's extractive industries in Africa. Is the latest piece in the China Quarterly. It's a lengthy piece, but then this one is more on the attitude survey and our summary. It's more at the level of interviews, but the piece I'm committed to, the China Environment Forum publication, is more about the ecological footprints and the anecdote stories and what they tell us about the behavior of Chinese state and local enterprises and their environment practice at home and its impact abroad. So I think I took more time than I needed. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. Now, he got a little extra time because he did give, I mean, your broad overview did lay the big context, which feeds into our next speakers. Why don't you guys do your musical chairs again?
Yeah, okay.
And his publication is online, and this PowerPoint will also be online as well for people that it's like, ooh, I want to see that fact, right? As it flew past you, so. Oh, you don't, yeah.
Where am I?
Where's Terry's?
Here,
piece?
you got it.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
So you go to the top, so set up slideshow.
Yes, where, here.
Just set up slideshow. No,
Okay.
right.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this
Pete, where's
setup.
the, from beginning? Yep. That would make sense. We'll start at the beginning.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you so much for that incredible introduction. I think it will give me the opportunity to talk more about other things, because you did such a great job of laying the foundation. I'll be the first to tell you I'm not a China expert at all. I live and work in Cambodia, and so the lens I'll put on today is really looking at development inside Cambodia, which is not limited to just China's influence, but an overall model for development of which China is a part. And I think flipping the picture now and looking at it from the other way, partnership is a two-way kind of thing. And so when China enters into a partnership on whatever level, they're going into a particular context. And what is that? What are some of the models for that context? What's happening that shapes how China's role?
A little closer, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, that shapes China's role in developing countries, and also shapes the role of the country in working with China. So, an old Cambodian proverb, I think, is maybe very apropos in this day and age: "Salted fish don't lay eggs." And I think that this is actually a great way to describe some of what's happening with development right now when we look at the intersection between climate issues and development. One primary question is, does economic growth equal development? That's a question that is not simply answered. I think typically we tend to think that economic growth will result in development, but in fact, in many countries, including Cambodia, one-off opportunities for development predominate, and the benefits for development are not equally shared. And of course, there's a continuum of that around the world. And does development equal improved quality of life? And again, for many people in this day and age, as natural resources are converted for other purposes, our assumption is that they're going to move into a labor market, that they're going to have a better diet, that they're going to have access to food and education and all those kinds of things. But in fact, the opposite often happens. And we'll see that this is a trend to some extent in Cambodia. So I'd like to look at the Cambodian case study. So Cambodia, in the 1960s and 70s, the development that was happening in the rest of the region really bypassed Cambodia, largely because of the war, but also because in the 80s and 90s, when Vietnam and Laos were moving ahead, Cambodia was still mired in its own political problems, including conflict with the Khmer Rouge, which was only really settled at the end of the 1990s. In many respects, that conflict actually protected Cambodia's natural resources. So Cambodia maintained a high level of forest cover like you don't see in other parts of Southeast Asia. So you do find that Cambodia's economy is still largely agrarian, including forest communities, and that's home to 80% of Cambodians. So the rural economies in Cambodia are primarily based, first of all, on rice. Also on non-timber forest products. You see here, this is a man collecting resin. And these non-timber forest products have typically been used in local economies, but are increasingly becoming important in the global economy as we look for more sustainable ways to use our forests and we look for sustainable products. So resin actually is a really high value product that could sustain forests, but also is very important locally. And a third sort of anchor of the rural economies is fish. In Cambodia, fish is virtually every farmer also fishes, and fish provides 80%, natural fisheries provide 80% of Cambodia's dietary protein. Very important. I want to look here at a map of Cambodia. Now this map is showing forest cover as of 2006. It would actually probably be a little bit before that. I want to note that that's been almost 5 years already, and this has changed significantly since then. But generally you'll see that there are these areas, these bands of green, one across the northeast, the other across the southwest. And then you see this kind of open area in the middle with the Tonle Sap. The blue is the Tonle Sap. The Mekong comes down through.
A little pointer.
Yeah. Okay. How do we do that?
You just push. There you go.
Okay. There.
Just hit the red dot.
Red dot. Okay. So here's the Mekong comes down from Laos. Come down this way, and then it comes back up to the Tonle Sap, goes back down to Vietnam that way. So these 4 rivers that meet in here. Okay. Cambodia's ecology is pretty simple to see from the map. Water tends to, oops, I didn't do that right. What did I do?
Oh, I think
Yes, I did. Okay.
you did do it.
Yeah,
Red dot.
I did do it. I did do it. Okay, water tends to flow in the country. Water tends to flow this direction, with some water flowing from here into the rice basin. That's what we would consider the rice basin. Previously, this area down here is more forested. So the bulk of Cambodia's rice production is in here. And the areas of highest yield are close to the Tonle Sap. And these areas are a little bit lower yield. Forested areas have not typically been used for rice production. And in fact, the soils under these forests are actually not even appropriate for agricultural production, particularly rice. So the best use of the soils is for the forests. However, since 1998 in particular, there's been very rapid deforestation happening in Cambodia. So we've seen significant loss of forest cover. So although technically on the maps you'd still see green in these areas, the forests are largely degraded, with some reports saying there's only about 3% primary forest left in Cambodia now. Now, one important area of forest is right here. This is a very important watershed. It also represents a lowland evergreen forest that used to be the most common landscape in the entire peninsula of Southeast Asia. Now it is the only forest of this kind left in the entire peninsula of any size. So it's very important for biodiversity. It's also important because of its watershed and sedimentation properties. Another watershed area is right here, very central cardamoms. So if we looked at what the bottom line ecologically is for Cambodia, it's the Mekong system and Tonle Sap, which provide fish and also provide water. It's the central forests of Prey Long, the greater Prey Long area, and it's the central cardamoms. And the coast has traditionally been really important. There's outside of Kampot down here, there's an area of 24,000 hectares of seagrass. That's the largest area of seagrass left in all of Southeast Asia. One of the largest areas of seagrass in the world. But the coast in general is being compromised significantly, and we'll look at that a little bit more later. So you can see, though, that the overall system of Cambodia it's a watershed and it's a woodshed. And in many ways, its best uses, well, we may look at, say, well, it's an agrarian economy. Its best uses are actually doing what it's doing. So it may not be a great model to look at converting it to industrial purposes. It may be better to look at other models for how these forests could be sustained and used and sustainably managed in different ways. Just so that you can see here, these areas, these are actually the protected areas in Cambodia. However, the protected areas have not necessarily been chosen for the ecological importance. They've been chosen somewhat as a matter of convenience because they don't have other things of high value like minerals in those areas. And they've also sometimes been chosen because of charismatic species. That's a problem, though, because that means the protected areas are not necessarily contributing to the overall environmental sustainability of Cambodia. And then those areas where there is great ecological importance, such as the Tonle Sap and the flood basin, the protected areas are actually not very well protected. There's quite a lot of leakage and degradation in those areas. They've also been being significantly reduced through development projects. You see all these purple dots here? That's where the population is centered. And so you can see the population actually is in the rice basin. While there are groups in the forested areas, they're much more lightly populated, and that's actually appropriate for the kind of landscape. And in addition to that, though, we're seeing a change. Great changes happen there with a lot of migration into those areas now. Some of those areas were not accessible previously because of war and because of mining and so forth, particularly over here on the west. This area, even in the rice basin, has been fairly thinly populated in comparison, largely because of mining and military activity. Now, as that opens up, you're seeing people come back into those areas, and we're also seeing a lot of conflict. So Cambodia's development profile in short. Cambodia has had some remarkable economic growth since the late 1990s, really seeing in more 7% or more for the last 14 years. The economy has been primarily built on garments, with tourism, construction, and agriculture second, and the garment industry has been dominated by the Chinese. And that's small-scale investment primarily. Some reports say that Cambodia's poverty rate's been reduced from 50% to about 30% in that time. However, there's some real debate in the development community about that, and that's partly because of how poverty is measured and why it's measured in certain ways. One issue is around a food basket. As people give up natural foods and go into a labor market, the assumption is, well, they make more money, so they can buy the food, but often the food that they can buy is not equivalent to what that they were producing or what they could access from natural resources previously. So there's some real debate about this. Expansion of roads. Cambodia's infrastructure has really developed in the last few years. Not quite as much as Laos, surprisingly, but still significantly. So most areas of the country are accessible now by road. That has good and bad points about it. There is a really high level of foreign investment in Cambodia as well. We could consider those more on the positive side. On the more negative side, we see that Cambodia is focused more on extensive growth, meaning exporting natural resources, as opposed to really developing the local economies. Given this, they're really vulnerable to external shocks. So we've seen arguably at least a reduction in the growth rate, if not actual contraction, in the last year or so with the global economic crisis. There's also a real problem in that Cambodia's economy is really being leveraged off of the sale and conversion of land and natural resources. And when you consider that 80% of Cambodia's people are dependent upon their own farms and forest resources, and that new jobs are not being created to replace that, then you can see that this becomes a real problem. Cambodia also has a low level of social services, with, for the most part, to a large extent, social services are being provided by nonprofit organizations, not completely, but to an extent that you probably would is quite unusual in the world, and that's part of the post-conflict UNTAC era. But it's also contributes to the overall development climate in Cambodia. And then, interestingly, there are weak or declining indicators. So while we see this reports that Cambodia is getting better. We can see the infrastructure is getting better. We have power, we have water, we have roads now, that kind of thing. We also see that there are people that are saying that they don't have, they have less to eat now in some areas than they did during the Khmer Rouge. That's not me that says that. That's them that says that. But for the rural poor, this is the reality for some people. There are also some reports that indicate declining child and maternal health indicators, and these at least raise questions. There's also an increasingly stratified society. So when I first went to Cambodia in 1991, it was fairly flat. So even though there was a vertical society on some level, as people said back then, we know the bottom can become the top and the top can become the bottom. So there was quite a lot of interplay. And not so much the difference between a rich person and a poor person was not so evident. Whereas now we see that there's great divides, particularly in the last 5 years. As more resources move into the hands of fewer people, and more money, more money and more land, particularly, are controlled by a fairly small group. The development context inside Cambodia is characterized still by complex or poorly implemented regulations. And that's to be understood given Cambodia's history. But there's also a certain extent to which those complex or poorly implemented regulations, of course, favor certain groups in the government, the power structure, I should say, and that power structure has been described, for instance, by Human Rights Watch as a convergence of the government, the private sector, and the military, and that's becoming increasingly strong. Inadequate policy framework, again, that's to be understood. Weak courts, high level of corruption, low technical capacity, with an education system that's not necessarily helping Cambodia move beyond that. Externally, Cambodia's participation in ASEAN and the ASEAN context are really, really important. So ASEAN's priorities have largely to do with trade, and China and ASEAN have developed there's the Asia Free Trade, I'm going to get it wrong, the Asia-China Free Trade Agreement, for instance, which is really opening up trade across the region. ADB corridors for development, economic corridors for development, which have outlined plans for centralized power grids, roads, rail systems, and so forth that will open up the countries to one another like never before. And that's facilitating a real explosion in trade in the region. We also see one of the interesting things that's happening in Cambodia is the partial withdrawal of the international financial institutes. And this is largely because they've come under some criticism themselves because of social and environmental issues in Cambodia. But as they withdraw, that's created somewhat of a vacuum for new financiers, and the Chinese and other Asian investors are leading the way in filling that vacuum. In fact, there seems to be somewhat of a competition between China and Cambodia, China, Korea, and Vietnam. Mm-hmm. The drivers, as Mr. Winran has explained some, is the expanding Asian economy is a real drive for new market economies, high and increasing levels of consumption, development of new markets, global food and security concerns, food and fuel security concerns. And I'd like to say a couple of words about just one or two of these points. I think China, we tend to focus on China, what they're getting from the country, the resources that they're extracting that they need to fuel their own economy. But in fact, I think China is also really looking at emerging markets as well. And developing those markets, and certainly Southeast Asia is an emerging market. The other thing that's driving it is not limited to China. These food and fuel security concerns are certainly shared across the region and also across the world. And interestingly, Cambodia then, as many countries in Africa and other parts of Asia, are becoming a sort of contesting ground for finding new resources in land. Cambodia is a country of about 15 to 16 million hectares. Only 4.5 million or so are arable. But so far, over the last couple of years in state-to-state agreements, more than 4 million hectares have been promised for contract farming or other kinds of farming agreements to provide food for other countries, chief of which is Kuwait, actually, which has been promised 4 million hectares for contract farming. That'll mean either a lot of money, a lot of land comes out of areas that are already being farmed, or that we'll be seeing the conversion of forest into rice. And we know with soil fertility that that's not necessarily the best use of those areas. Okay. Fuel security concerns is also driving conversion of rice and forest into cassava production, sugarcane, and jatropha. So here we go. This is it. This is Cambodia. The areas that you see outlined in red here, these are known economic land concessions. And these are the economic land concessions of generally about 3,000 hectares or more. Okay, there are many, many more concessions, but they're not in the public domain. So the only thing that's on this map is things that can be shown to be in the public domain. More than 50 economic land concessions are listed. I think half of those are believed to have Chinese partnerships. Okay. Also, the blue areas, these are concessions for mines. Those are for mines for hard minerals only. They don't count things like sand dredging, stone cutting, limestone, that kind of thing. So this relates to iron, copper, bauxite, and so forth. There's more than 100 concessions in the country. The largest concession is 1,520 square kilometers, which is pretty interesting given that the largest operating mine in the world is only about 7 square kilometers. So this calls into question what's happening with this land that's being concessioned for extractive industries at this early stage. While we see the deals being made and land being transferred and communities being displaced, we don't see a lot of mining activities starting yet, or at least not on a big scale. there are some exceptions. But the companies are not necessarily constrained to mine. They can also log those areas, and timber does have a really high value in Cambodia. So they can log the areas. They could also use other areas for other purposes other than mining, for instance, Jatrova, Cassava, and so forth. Okay. See these little triangles? Different colors. Those are all dams. 66 dam projects in Cambodia that have been projected. Even if only half of those went ahead, that would still be pretty significant. Right now, there are 7 projects involving the Chinese, for which there's already been money obligated, and construction is underway in 2-3 of those sites already. Most important one down in Kamchai, down in this area, and Kampot, backing up onto a protected area. Okay, and the hydropower is supposed to be providing, it's being sold in Cambodia, promoted in Cambodia as going to provide power for the Cambodian people, only about 15% of which have power. However, you note the power lines. They go to Vietnam and they go to Thailand. And the cost in converting for local domestic use would be too high. So really the intention of these hydropower plants is to provide for industry or to be sold to Cambodia or Thailand. Again, interestingly, this is part of a regional development plan, but there's quite a lot of studies that are demonstrating that the projections for energy use in Southeast Asia have been overestimated, and that there will never be a market for most of this. Okay, these are the oil areas. It's not working now.
Did you wear it out?
I think I wore it out. Yeah. So down on the coast, you see these blocks. Those are the offshore oil areas, some of which have already been concessioned. But there are also the entire country has been blocked for oil. So there is oil exploration, for instance, in the Tonle Sap. And inside, there's gold concession, exploration license, and some oil, I understand, inside or close to the Angkor Wat area as well. Okay, so when you look at this, you see the bulk of development is in these ecologically important, really important areas. So what this does is it starts to call into question how sustainable can the environment be? And it even calls into question the business plan, because how, dams and mines don't necessarily go together very well. Okay? Agricultural industry is going to dump a lot of pollution into the water. That's going to affect the fisheries. There's a lot of issues here about the overall sustainability of this approach. And yet it is quite consistent with the ASEAN ADB vision of promoting trade and industry in the region. Just some Jatropha for you. Here's conversion of forest. You could see small scale and large scale. Down here on the right is a small scale mine. As what we're seeing is that there's an upgrading from very local production into sort of mid-scale production, which is not very environmentally sound. And again, that does include a range of companies, both Cambodian, but there's also quite some Chinese involvement, but it's usually small scale comparatively. Here we've got some of the coastal areas. So we mentioned this area of seagrass. There's a real competition for land inside Cambodia. So one of the ways to increase your resources to create more land. So there's whole areas that are being filled. Okay. Yeah. And this is, you'll see a Chinese survey about dam development. This is dredging in the Mekong, which has since been banned, but there have been hundreds of dredgers, but in both Cambodia and Vietnam, to both to deepen the channel of the river to allow for transportation all the way up to China, but also for the sale of sand. It's causing the collapse of riverbanks and the change in the river ecology. Another impacted development is land conflict and forced evictions, both urban and rural. Amnesty International has projected that about 250,000 people are at risk for eviction in Cambodia. However, that reflects only 3 urban areas and doesn't really look at the full scope of land alienation in the country. And the other consequence is we see this rapid conversion of critical ecologies to industrial purposes. So what are the problems with that? You know, we're going to see this uncounted and undeferred costs. So the model is only looking at what the short-term economic benefit is. We're not looking at the loss of high-value carbon woodsheds. Not looking at how watersheds are being compromised. And again, Cambodia is quite important regionally for both water and fish, as well as for the wood. We see declining soil fertility, and this is an environmental problem that you might not be very aware of, but around the world, soil fertility in general is declining. It's related to how industrial agriculture, and we're seeing this in the rice bowl as well. A loss of biodiversity. And again, Cambodia has been the last reserve for many kinds of animals and plants, many of which could be important as food crops or medicinals. And threats to indigenous cultures. What's happening?
There it comes.
It's really slow. And so overall, there's some really high costs for this conversion. If we come to China's role, and I'm gonna leverage off of what Ran was saying. You know, what we see here is that there have been some real opportunities for China, and that China sees Cambodia as a resource-rich country, and that there is quite a lot of investment Chinese investment into Cambodia. In fact, China is the largest investor in Cambodia. Not China not as a state, but China at various levels. China is also one of the biggest aid partners in one of the biggest aid partners in Cambodia as well. So China should be concerned, as other donors should be concerned in Cambodia itself, with development as a threat to Cambodia. If we look if we're not looking at the landscape level, if we're not looking at alternative ways to build the markets and to use the resources, then development itself could undermine the long-term sustainability of Cambodia. And I think we're already seeing issues in the country across the region. The Southeast Asia has been identified as being an area highly prone to risk for climate change, with Cambodia at the very highest level of that. And the reason why Cambodia is at a high level, and surprisingly so given that it's not a coastal country, is because of an inability to mitigate and because of logging and the conversion of land into other purposes. Right. So again, I'm just gonna. I could go on a little bit more about China, but the thing is that I'm not a China expert. But what we see is that China offers some real opportunities for Cambodia. On the positive side, there are green technologies being developed in China. There are some very innovative models for even forest management that involve communities and business and public-private partnerships. There's China's new move toward best practices and improved standards. And all of these are really positive. Because what it comes down to is the nature of the partnership between China and a country like Cambodia. And this is where we get to the idea of no strings aid. And on one hand, I mean, there are definitely some advantages to this, and certainly a country like Cambodia appreciates it. The leadership appreciates this. They've called China their most trustworthy partner. But the people of Cambodia often have a very different view on that, because they actually see the threats of Chinese companies, Vietnamese companies, Korean companies, Cambodian companies in quite different ways. So there is perhaps a need to look at the interests of the Cambodian people at a variety of levels, not just at the leadership level, and also in terms of serving Cambodia's long-term interests, including the leadership's interests, and in terms of serving the business community. I think it is really imperative that that in Cambodia and the region that there are more long-range landscape planning approaches to looking at development, and that China is in a position of influencing Cambodia's thinking in this way. And so that could be a very positive role that China plays. So looking at the nature of aid and the interaction between foreign direct investment and the role in China, in Cambodia, there is perhaps room for a different kind of partnership than what we've seen to date. And then finally, I think there are some really thorny issues in Cambodia. I mean, one is that hydropower is not necessarily environmentally friendly, and yet it has been a primary, a primary platform for development for China. And new debates inside China may change that view. Migration, as Mr. Wenran mentioned, is also an issue in Cambodia. If you expect development to bring jobs to Cambodians, but then it's Chinese that are coming to take the jobs, and that calls into question the dynamic as well. So there are a lot of thorny questions here. On the other hand, in Southeast Asia, China is not just an investor or just a development partner. They're also a neighbor. So it really behooves everybody to look at the relationship in a different way and to find new models for development in the region.
Okay, good. I love this. We got a lot of details. Yeah, thank you so much. And beforehand, I taught Victor I grew up in baseball land, that he's the closing pitcher today. And it's not a game that's being lost. You can stay there. So you get to close us out here.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor, a great privilege for me to be here at Woodrow Wilson Center. Just now, I listened very carefully to the presentations by the two previous panelists. Have you noticed that most of these keywords like China, Canada, Cambodia, copper, crude oil, climate change, etc., all started with a C, to such an extent that I suspected that probably Jennifer grouped them together on alphabetical order. So in China, we emphasize one big word, that is harmony. So in order to be harmonious with this C character, I've tentatively decided that for the duration of this discussion, I've changed my GAO to CAO. Actually, I've written down here. So, but on the more serious side, although we are holding this conference here in Washington, D.C., very close to the Atlantic, I don't think you will disagree with me that for the first time since Industrial Revolution, the three largest economies in the world are now Pacific economies. Now, President Obama has called himself the first Pacific president of the United States when he visited Asia this time, although there are people who are not very happy with this characterization. But it is also for the first time since the Industrial Revolution that two of the three largest economies in the world are now in Northeast Asia, that is Japan and China. And all indications seem to be that China will surpass Japan either by the end of this year or no later than 2010 as the second largest economy in the world. If you read GDP numbers based on purchasing power parity compiled by the World Bank and IMF, actually I came across the IMF building on my way to this Woodrow Wilson Center early this morning, then the Chinese economy actually is much larger already than the Japanese economy. The Goldman Sachs recently published a research report pinpointing the year 2027 as the year the Chinese economy will surpass that of the United States to be the largest economy in the world. Now, what does all this mean? From the Chinese perspective, I think we are really very happy that after 30 years of economic development and opening to the outside world, China has managed to achieve what it might have taken 100 or even 200 years for many other countries to have achieved in a very short span of time. And also, I think because there is a urgency in China to maintain a minimum of 8% GDP growth for the foreseeable future, mainly because in China the rule of thumb is that 1% GDP growth will translate into about more than 1 million new jobs to be added to the economy. And in China, each year we need to accommodate 12 million new jobs to be created. So if we have GDP growth less than 8%, that means there will be many people who will not be able to find a job when they enter the labor market. But if you assume that the Chinese economy will continue to grow minimum 8% a year for the foreseeable future, what does it mean? It means that the Chinese GDP will double again in about 8 or 9 years. And it may double again, that is what we call quadruple, in about 15 years or 16 years. So that's why I think Goldman Sachs actually was not too inaccurate when they most recently picked 2027 as the year for China to be the largest economy in the world. Now, as a result of this rapid growth of the Chinese economy, we know the Chinese demand for many things, crude oil, energy, minerals, etc., is there. And I think it will remain very, very strong demand for many years to come. Crude oil, China already relies on imported crude oil for 50% of its oil consumption. And the import reliance is expected to grow to 65 to 70% in the coming 10 years or so. Even though China and the United States are the two largest coal reserve countries, China actually imports a lot of coal from overseas. This is mainly because many of the coal reserves in China are in the northern part of China, and the railway transportation has a high degree of congestion, and sometimes it's easier and cheaper actually to import coal from other parts of the world and ship them to especially the southern coastal cities in China. And most of the coal is used to generate power. And if you have followed the news development, most recently there was a Chinese ship, 75,000 tons, which was hijacked 700 nautical miles away from the African coast in the middle of the Indian Ocean by Somali pirates. And that ship was carrying 75,000 tons of coal from Southern Africa. Now, many people actually tend to dismiss China, even though China has really made very breathtaking economic results. But maybe not all of you know that China, by the end of this year, will be the largest manufacturer of automobiles and also will be the largest purchaser of automobiles. Many of you probably do not know that for more than a dozen years already, China has been the largest manufacturer of motorcycles, even though Harley-Davidson here produced still is the best brand in the motorcycle business.
We're seeing another side of you, Victor.
Yeah. Therefore, I think, going forward, if you ask me, for example, where to buy a jumbo airplane, I will not recommend China. But if you ask me, where do you find a rocket which can launch a satellite into orbit, China is actually one of the few countries or conglomerates which actually have that capabilities. So in this sense, I think China going forward will not only continue to generate strong demand, but we'll also climb up the manufacturing ladder by emphasizing much more of intellectual property rights, by emphasizing more of brand, and also by working more closely with their foreign counterparts in setting up distribution network and also acquiring brands for their own products. Now, since we are now here in the Canada Institute, may I just add a few words? Because we are talking about all these key terms with starting with a C. When I was in Calgary at the kind invitation of Professor Wenran, I actually coined a new term, try to linking up China and Canada together. It's called China-da, China and Canada, combined into one word. And this is mainly because, for China and Canada, two countries which complement so much in their economic circumstances, it is ludicrous that Canada is running a huge trade deficit in its trade with China. Canada actually only exports about 1/3 of what Australia exports to China. So I think, if Canada can give enough emphasis to its political relations as well as business relations with China, Canada is well positioned to double, triple, or even quadruple its export to China, thus creating, thousands of new jobs in Canada. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we fully understand that the gravitational pull of the United States on Canada is such that it will remain there for decades to come. However, growing trade between China and Canada, or let's say the development of China, does not need to grow at the expense of Canada's relations with the United States. And this is mainly because when China is positioned between the United States, the largest economy in the world, and China, which will soon become the second largest economy in the world, and for many decades to come in the future, Canada will be well positioned in two largest economies in the world. Whether China is number one, US is number one is immaterial. How can you afford to neglect, doing business with one of the two largest economies in the world? And also, as I learned in our Calgary discussions, the shipping distance from the western coast of Canada to the eastern coast of China is actually shorter than the shipping distance between Australia to China. And you probably have noticed that recently, earlier this year, China and Australia announced another blockbuster new deal totaling $45 billion US. That is for CNPC, the largest Chinese oil company, to purchase on a long-term contract basis LNG produced actually by ExxonMobil in their gas fields in Australia. So I think, I'm a big fan of China because I believe that the trade relations between these two great countries can only grow. It is incomprehensible that among all the countries in the world, Canada need to run up such a huge trade deficit with China. Therefore, I think sometimes when we look at these trade and economic development, we need to use wisdom. We need to refuse to allow whatever differences there are between, for example, China and Canada to hold us hostage, because otherwise both of these countries are going to suffer. Therefore, I think it is really a great pleasure that Prime Minister Palmer is now in Beijing. But let me tell you one secret which I learned before I left Beijing on this visit. I learned from a very reliable source that Prime Minister, since we are talking about climate change, Prime Minister Harper said in a cabinet meeting in Ottawa that if President Obama did not go to Copenhagen for the climate change conference, he will not go. Now that both President Obama and the Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao will go to Copenhagen, I think Prime Minister Harper most likely will need to rearrange his travel plans, because his last day in China will be December the 6th. And he probably will need to rush directly from China, wherever he is, to Copenhagen to attend the climate change conference. But when we talk about Canada, one thing comes up to our attention right away. That is the oil sands, which is also called sometimes by some environmentally friendly people, especially here in this country, in the United States, as dirty oil. I think in my numerous discussions, I used to work with China National Offshore Oil Company, which is the dominant offshore oil company in China. And we had many discussions with our Canadian counterparts. Actually, CNOOC, which bid for Unical in 2005 and did not get that deal because of political oppositions here on the Capitol Hill, was the first major Chinese oil company to invest in oil sands in Canada. And by now, the other two larger oil companies, CNPC and Sinopec, have all invested in the oil sand business in Alberta. And even the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund, China Investment Corporation, recently has also completed investment in the mineral situation in Canada. Therefore, I think in terms of the oil sand development as well as the related infrastructure, for example, the Gateway project, the transportation line from Alberta all the way to the Pacific coast, and the shipping arrangements, and also the related refinery capabilities, etc., China has not only the financial resources to help invest in these very large and capital-intensive projects, but also has the capability of refining these oil sand products, and also has the big market to absorb whichever production eventually will result from the oil sand development. So I think, when you look at China, China is no longer what most people tend to believe as a kind of a cheap labor, low-end manufacturer. It is not. In my experience, each time when I go back to Beijing after some extended stay outside of China, sometimes a couple of weeks or a month, China is changing very rapidly. That explains that, while the rest of the world, Napoleon used to say, don't disturb China, it's a sleeping lion. But it seems now that the rest of the world is sleeping and China is laboring off like crazy. They are very much engaged in what we call development. And I had the honor of working as Deng Xiaoping's interpreter in the 1980s. He basically called the development as the hard truth. He basically said, development is the hard truth. Don't argue with me. Don't argue between socialism versus capitalism. Development is the hard truth. Productivity is the hard truth. I recently proposed a revision of Deng Xiaoping's slogan. I call the green development is the hard truth, is the soft truth, and is the smart truth. Because I think going forward, in order to be sustainable, China not only need to develop, China need to develop in a green way. And we are kind of stuck in the old paradigm because Deng Xiaoping said development is the hard truth. We developed and developed. We did not argue about socialism versus capitalism. We focused on productivity and development. But in this process, we probably did not pay enough attention to environmental protection, etc., because paradigms keep changing. Going forward, I think we need to pay much more attention to climate change, and it is very encouraging that when the Chinese Prime Minister was in Egypt attending the 4th Ministerial Summit meeting with the African countries, when he announced the 8 new measures that China and the African countries need to work on together, the first item on the short list is China and African countries cooperating together on climate change issues. Now, before I left Beijing, I made a speech at a very important meeting, and I basically tried to further enhance my countrymen's awareness of climate change. And I basically said, if we do not do it properly, China may be the largest victim of climate change. This is mainly because while most people talk about climate change in terms of the melting of the glacier in Arctic Ocean and the rising of the sea level by, let's say, 0.5 meter or a couple of meters, which will negatively impact upon China too, our grave danger, on the other hand, is the potential melting away of the glacier on the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau. You know that most of the major rivers in China, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, as well as rivers in Southeast Asia, Mekong River, and also in South Asia, like the Ganges, the Indus River, etc. They all originate from the Tibetan Plateau, the rich of the world. And when the glaciers are surrounded by China to its east, of course the glaciers are in China, and also India to its south, two of the largest, most rapidly developing countries in the world, then most likely the glacier, just like the glacier in the Arctic Ocean, will melt. That will not only create disasters for this generation or for whichever generation who will face the melting away of the glaciers, but also it will be a disaster for many, many generations to come. Therefore, I think, people in China will hopefully sooner rather than later raise their awareness of the climate change issues and try to really get up to speed, not only in what they are doing at home, but also in what they are doing whenever they go abroad. Now, when I was with the CNOOC, we always say, as a company, you need to go wherever there is oil. Wherever there is oil, you need to go. Let me clarify one point for your benefit. That doesn't mean that wherever you go as an oil company to explore and develop oil, you need to ship the oil all the way back to your home country. It is very encouraging that recently CNOOC, CNOOC, acquired a very tiny oil block in the Gulf of Mexico. Allegedly, it is the first Chinese investment in the Gulf of Mexico in the oil and gas field, and this may eventually pave the way for more Chinese investments. I will bet that the oil thus produced in the Gulf of Mexico will most likely be sold to the closest purchaser, most likely a refinery somewhere off the coast of Louisiana. Rather than being shipped at such a huge astronomical distance all the way across several oceans back to China. It doesn't make any economic sense. The other thing is that we know that in the United States there is also very rich reserve of shale gas, which can be developed into kind of a natural gas equivalent. And in our recent discussions with some of these states which have very strong and rich shale gas reserves, they actually mention that they run into one particular problem. That is, they do not have companies which have enough financial resources or which can raise money from the banks or from the capital markets to develop the shale gas. Now, while it is still too preliminary at this stage to talk about how the Chinese and the Americans can work on this particular situation, I am personally very encouraged to see that this actually, if we deal with this situation properly, can be one of the first situations where the Chinese financial resources and their industrial capabilities can be brought to play in a particular situation here in the United States with the assurance that the gas that's produced will be supplied locally. That's another example to show you that China can be a good investor rather than having to ship everything back home. For some of the extractive mineral resources, yes. For example, if you read either Newsweek or Time, in this recent issue, there is a big article about Chinese extractive business in Papua New Guinea. They are building that. They are building all the related infrastructures, the bridges, the schools, the highways, etc., the ports, etc. They want to ship the minerals thus produced back to China smeltery for processing. But in many other situations, you do not need to. Therefore, I think from the American perspective, especially when there is such a short of liquidity in the market, don't leave the abundant supply of funding on the Chinese side idle. China, after all, is the largest creditor nation to the United States. It's the first time in human memory that a developing country with relatively low per capita income has become the largest creditor nation to the only surviving superpower in the world. Give me another example throughout history, and I will be amazed. Therefore, I've always said that while we have differences about, for example, human rights, about democracy, etc., be a little bit gentle to your largest creditor. Don't be too abrasive. We can get along, and let's use probably the shale gas as one of the examples to see whether we can, transcend whatever differences there are. Now, if you allow me, let me tell you that when I mentioned the many smaller and medium-sized smelters in the Congo, is that right? I will bet again that most of these enterprises are what we call small and medium-sized private enterprises. In China, very briefly, when we started this reform and opening to the outside world towards the end of the 1970s, the economy, either in the urban area or in the rural area, were almost 100% state-owned. People's commune in the rural China, as well as all the factories, state-owned factories in the countries, in the urban areas. By now, state-owned enterprises only account for about 1/3 of the economy, and private-owned enterprises, POEs as we sometimes call it, account for another 1/3 of the economy. And this is on the basis of a very rapidly expanding base of the economy. You are not talking about 1/3 of the GDP as of 1978, you are talking about 1/3 of the GDP as the third largest economy in the world, and the second largest economy based on the PPP basis. So, and the other remaining 1/3 is the foreign invested enterprises in China. The SOEs versus the POEs, they have very different, ways of operation, and sometimes, they are basically very different animals. So whenever you deal with them, whenever you come across with them, and if you need to engage them, be aware of their differences in personality, in their lineage, in their transparency differences, etc. And you need to deal with them, as they are, but don't confuse some of the characteristics of one category of companies with the other one, or don't confuse particular problems which may exist for one particular category of companies as if they represent the totality of China. Now, being Chinese is sometimes a onerous thing because we have so many of them. We have China said it has 1.3 billion population for almost 10 years. So I always suspect that we have 1.4 billion already in China. And overseas diaspora, Chinese diaspora numbers way above 50 million to almost, another 100 million. So you are talking about very, very large group of people. Each one is different. But from the outsider's perspective, you tend to equate any Chinese as the totality of the Chinese. If they have difficulties or if they have defects or problems, it is easy to equate as if that problems or weaknesses. Even Tiger Woods have weaknesses, as we realized yesterday, as if that's the totality of the Chinese. So be a little bit gentle again. So whenever you come across problems, which I do, if I trust the accuracy of the photographs, I would say these companies, small smelteries, etc., they probably have cut a lot of corners in their refining activities in the Congo. And if you apply either the local law or the Chinese law, they need to be disciplined. I think they need to be fined and really collect the fines from them in order to enhance their awareness to the environmental consciousness. So let me be very brief, and I will wrap up waiting for your questions. That is, why the Chinese kind of a model is very effective in globalization, especially in developing countries. To start with, let me tell you, in my best judgment, China actually does not have several things to export, even though it exports almost everything. Now, first of all, we do not have a religion to export. This is very important. Most of the Chinese are very secular. And whatever mild Buddhism we have is very much diluted by our deep-rooted Confucianism. So we actually don't have a religion to export. We actually deal with whomever religious believers, the Christians, the Catholics, the Protestants, whatever, the Muslims, the Jews, I think with equal respect, because we really cannot tell the differences. Because to us, God is a little bit secular in nature rather than very religious. And we also don't have an ideology to export. Very, very important. Some people, especially on the Capitol Hill, and if you work with any of the senators or the congressmen, mention this one. They always say, red China. I apologize, I do wear a red tie. Or they say, communist China, as if there is no change. I can declare and put for the record that communism, as we understood before China opened to the outside world, is dead. Whatever we have in China is not the communism that you understood, or the Soviets did, or whatever. We basically kept the same bottle, but the contents has been changed. And Deng Xiaoping, in order to avoid confusing anyone, including himself, insisted that is socialism with Chinese characteristics, which can equally mean capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Therefore, we are very much amused. And I think we can have another session talking about this. Okay. That is, after the financial crisis, when the Americans are confused about whether Obama is a socialist or capitalist or capitalist roader in China, we are very confused. All these labels don't matter. What matters very much is whether you can bring food and bread to the table, is whether you can bring turkey to the table for Thanksgiving. Otherwise, even if you have the best system or the ism, if you cannot produce productivity and deliver food and bread and butter to the table, it's a failing ideology. So China doesn't have ideology to export. The other thing is that China doesn't believe, and we refuse to believe, that we possess truth. Deng Xiaoping said, development is the truth, is the hard truth. But what do you mean by development? Development tomorrow need to be larger than development today. So you are constantly development. So in China, what we say is practice is the test of truth. You need to keep practicing. Whenever you need to see whether something is real or not, is really something very, very true or not, put it to test. And if it survives the test, that's the truth. But the truth of today will be outdated tomorrow. So you need to have another truth. So in China, we don't have the truth to export. So whatever Beijing consensus, as this Mr. Ramos of the Kissinger Associates has come up with, we refuse to accept that. We say there is no consensus. In China, how can you expect that 1.4 billion people have consensus? We argue with each other. We compete with each other. One region compete with another one, etc. That means if you are a Chinese company, and this may be very close to truth, if you are a Chinese company, whether you are state-owned or privately owned, if you can survive brutal market competition in China and become one of the top 5 or top 10 companies in your sector, that means the whole Chinese market is yours, 1.3 or 1.4 billion people, because in China we don't have different languages. The written language is the same. You don't have differences in your political system. The provinces, etc., are more or less the same. So the market base or the customer base is the same. So if you can move onto the top echelon of one particular sector in China, what does this mean? That means, almost by default, going abroad to any other part of the world is a natural extension of your domestic success. So don't be surprised that many Chinese companies will become more and more global in the coming decades. But if you talk about these Chinese extractive businesses, I will be done very quickly. Okay. 1 minute. I think one is that.
Listen to you all day, though. That's what's ridiculous.
One is that from the Chinese side, they tend to engage the government first. That's why in America, this recipe doesn't work, because when you engage with the American government, it's better now because they own the Citibank now. You engage them for no good constructive purposes. But in Africa, for example, if you engage the local governments, you really engage the real party, and then you identify what are the projects. The Chinese are always focused on the projects. What are the projects that they need to build up, infrastructure, etc. Then they come up with a solution. Once they provide a solution, it can be a one-stop shop, because the Chinese can actually deliver all these component parts in the total solution, including financing, including labor, including equipment, including management, including the track record, including the trustworthiness, including their commitment to honor their contract, and also, very importantly, including the very large sustainable market which can absorb these products, whatever it is. Therefore, I think to wrap up, China will be there for decades or even centuries to be engaged with the United States. I think it requires wisdom on both sides, both China's side and the U.S. side, that the relations will be handled very properly so that we will always kind of grow with each other, nurture each other. And I recently published an op-ed article on CNN.com I called incentivize each other. China and the United States need to mutually incentivize each other rather than kind of dismiss or marginalize each other. Sabotaging China doesn't serve any particular purpose. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for staying over time.
Yeah, so we just have just a couple minutes left to ask some questions. So I need to really demand that I have really short questions that can have short answers because we just have a few minutes. So raise your hand. Ada will hand you the mic. Say your name and affiliation real quick, and we'll be off. You can tackle them gracefully afterwards. Ada, can you pass the mic? Thanks.
Thanks for speakers' wonderful speech. And I'm Luna Liu, a research assistant in Kissinger Institute, working for Dr. Wu Junhua. I have a question that after global financial crisis, like Chinese export-oriented industry got severely challenged, and then Chinese government re-emphasized on the policy of transition from heavy industry-oriented society to the consumption society. So how would you observe this kind of a policy transition will change the Chinese company, especially the extraction activities overseas? That the question go to Mr. Gao and Mr. Jiang. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, and it's like there's probably one answer.
Thank you very much. I owe a great deal to Dr. Kissinger. He wrote me a letter of recommendation when I applied to Yale. So whomever who is associated with the Kissinger Associates is someone I hold in great respect. Now, I think if you look at the Chinese export to the United States, yes, indeed, ever since the financial crisis, in total volume, it's contracting. However, you need to notice that China's export to the United States as a percentage of U.S. import is increasing quite significantly. That means even though the U.S. import from abroad is slowing down, the Chinese percentage, the Chinese share of that pie is actually increasing. That means that I'm still very much a believer of the Chinese competitiveness of the manufacturing. And don't be surprised, because going forward, in addition to the lower end products that China is very good at exporting, China is now exporting wind power equipment to a wind farm in Texas, for example. China has signed up an agreement with GE when Secretary Chu visited China for cooperating on the high-speed train railway in the United States. And China is now talking with the Russians for helping them to upgrade their railway system, which is very dilapidated. Therefore, I think Chinese export will be there, and they will really be changing in nature. They are moving more and more to the higher end, more technology intensive, etc. On the other hand, I think, if you look at China, I always say, even though China always is very sensitive about the Taiwan issue and say there is only one China, I always say there are two Chinas, the rural China versus the urban China. And the rural China, the numbers vary a great deal. You always have about 700 million to 800 million, roughly about 55% to 60% of the total population. So the next wave of the 21st century is the urbanization of the Chinese countryside. That will basically generate a lot of demand in China, which will basically become another pillar for generating huge demand in China. So I think going forward in the coming 10 years or 20 years, you will see China, first of all, continue to grow its export, even though the composition of the exported goods will be changing. On the other hand, very much devoted to the what we call, in general terms, the urbanization process. So I think there will be two pillars, two growth engines in China, rather than the focus on the export engine as before in the past 30 years or so.
But but overall, that would mean, to get another angle to your question is that, I think the extractive industries will continue and only grow because there's the two new economies. I think we had a question. Canada Institute.
Well, first I wanted to say, this French expression, je vais me coucher moins bête ce soir, which politely and loosely translated, I learned a lot today. I have a question, sort of taking what Terry was talking about, green tech, Chinese investments in green tech coming into Cambodia, which is great, but then the perception that one sees when China invests in the oil sands in Canada doesn't look as green tech as that. And I was just wondering if is China considering sort of green tech stuff in Canada as well as a developing country like Cambodia?
And I just one comment is that we're not seeing that technology in Cambodia yet, but it offers. I think we'd like to see Chinese companies trying to look at how to transfer that technology into Cambodia. The primary technology that we're seeing that's being promoted as green is hydropower dams, which aren't very green at all. And so we're looking for a different kind of relationship there. So just to clarify.
But China is we've heard all about how China in clean tech is, becoming number one in the world, but they are the third, sometimes now maybe second largest investor in different emerging technologies, nano and others, and what's driving a lot of this investment is to try to find high-tech solutions to pollution problems and promote energy efficiency. And so in our Asia Futures report, and we talked to a lot of experts, and they said that kind of what you're saying, the expectation is that, China is setting the bar for the rest of Asia in terms of this is the research direction, and these are the technologies we're going to do. And again, your expert orientation that these technologies will eventually go there, and it does. We're running out of time today, but I think we have to have another meeting to really try to go deeper into how do you kind of encourage this kind of green tech stuff that goes overseas, the same way encouraging the better environmental governance that's emerging in China to spill over into their activities in Southeast Asia. Otherwise, okay. I think you are a closing picture now.
Okay, thank you. I think green tech is very important because that's part of green development that we attach so much importance to. And I think China most likely will emerge as one of the, if not the most important manufacturer in the green technologies. China is already the largest manufacturer of wind power, solar power, and China is well positioned to be the most important manufacturer of electric cars. And also, in terms of the hybrid cars, China is way ahead of many other major automobile manufacturers. And don't forget, China is the largest battery manufacturer in the world for cellular phone, for other things. So the electric car business in China is well positioned to take off. Therefore, when we listen to President Obama's emphasis on the green technology, we actually think China and the United States need to work together. Because, for example, if the United States definitely is in possession of many, R&D results. But if you do not leverage it off on China, which has the manufacturing capability and also have the larger market demand going forward, it's not going to take off. If China and the United States are at each other's throat in green technology, both of us will be hurt. But if we can really hold hand in hand and enhance cooperation in green technology, both of us will be winners. And we will be together, leading the world in the green technology development.
Wenran, do you want to say anything?
Just quick work on David's question about the Chinese oil sands investment in Alberta. Actually, in every year's annual energy conference that we organize, the Chinese have been asking about the environmental impacts of the oil sands. Actually, it's predated to some of the outbursts of Canadian domestic debate because their perception is that Canada is not Africa. So when you come, you have to follow all the rules. And all the big companies follow the rules actually in Africa as well, especially energy companies. They're doing quite well, at least my experience, because they want to be there. They call it, 100-year process. They want to do a solid job. So they want to see if there are regulations they have to follow regarding environment. So they're quite aware of that now.
Okay, as I feel like I'm a sponsor of Sesame Street. This meeting was brought to you by the letter C. And I also, besides thanking the letter C, my speakers in the audience, it would be remiss if I did not thank my funders. USAID, Vermont Law School, Western Kentucky University, and I need to make a slide. I finally can say there are too many to say in one breath. Environment Foundation, Center for Global Partnership, and the Blue Moon Fund, which the last one, your comment there, Victor, about U.S. and China working together on energy. We're doing this project called Cooperative Competitors. We're starting up about how and why can the U.S., what are the specifics that the U.S. and China can cooperate on this clean green tech. And what? Yes, and the congressional funds. Sorry, I was like, and the Wilson Centers, but no, congressional funds. Yes, we have another C. So, and also thank Canada Institute for all their heavy lifting, and Pete and all these people. It's just like worse than the Academy Awards. Thank you very much. You didn't get a lot of questions in, but come and gently tackle them. There is a meeting in here at 12, so I'll have to scoot you guys out by 11:30. Thank you very much.